Okay, Jack, here we are, and we are going to talk about the rise of autocracies happening in the world. This is something that I personally kind of started to explore maybe a couple years ago, must have been a year or so ago. I actually read a book by this woman here. Her name is Annie Applebaum. This is actually just one of her articles from The Atlantic. It's about kleptocracy. This is pointing to the Trump administration. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But she also wrote another book called Autocracy. So, what is the idea that she's sort of giving bear to? So, there is a rise of authoritarian type governments, so less sort of democracy and less sort of liberal democracies happening across the world. So, what does that even mean? Like, what are these major trends? Okay, so in both Autocracy Inc. as well as Kleptocracy Inc., just modern authoritarian governments create like complete systems to steal resources and infrastructure from the peoples. There's all sorts of obviously conflict of interest when it comes to this, many regulatory rollbacks. And actually, the social media as its usage of control is really sort of a big factor here. You also see things like the rise of populism. We know there's a rise of nationalism, of course, as well. Institutional erosion. So you'll see certain leaders come to power. Maybe they kick out the certain judges, or they install other judges to do things for their favor. There's rise in both the censorship as well as propaganda. And some of these autocrats actually work together in tandem. So it's really an interesting time for government in general. And the other thing I wanted to preface before we kind of get into this discussion is that this isn't a political show, but we still do talk about government. And while, of course, I know that there's maybe some potential of directions of leanings of authoritarianism in the United States, it's frankly happening globally. And it's been happening for, frankly, since at least when Anne was talking about it, for sure, obviously, the rise of Russia and the sort of kleptocratic, oligarchic government that's been happening since the fall of the Soviet Union. And then more specifically in the near term, sort of the Viktor Orbán government there in Hungary, and then other sort of leaders. You see Duterte in the Philippines, the rise of Modi in India, and many others all around the world. Frankly, one of the newest ones there, the El Salvador leader, who I think now is going to be their leader perhaps for life. So it's an interesting thing, because I think the 20th century was this liberal democracy order. Remember us going into Iraq and Afghanistan, we were going to liberate the peoples and bring democracy and capitalism everywhere. And of course, in the 21st century, we're actually seeing the opposite. And we're seeing the rise of a nationalistic, authoritarian populism coupled with authoritarian, perhaps technology infrastructure. And it's leading us in some interesting directions. And I guess we'll have to see how it goes. So, have you been noticing this too? What are your thoughts? What are some of the initial ideas you have when it comes to not only dealing with it, but just what's some of the interesting maybe plot points we may have as we sort of go through this?
You're right there with me. I mean, Chris, I think that unfortunately, it's something that we've been tracking for a while, and it is increasing, the rise of authoritarianism. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that is. One thing is that you have these really powerful authoritarian governments being created. I consider like the China, I consider them to be an authoritarian government. I consider Russia to be an authoritarian government. And, there are a couple other places, but especially in Africa, right? So what's happening is these authoritarian governments are supporting other authoritarian governments. And so that's what's enabling them to thrive and grow, especially if you look at like what's happening in Africa. Africa, if you see what's been happening with, Putin's private army, right, as the Wagner Group has been called, right, is they are propping up authoritarian regimes in Africa, right? And what's unfortunately happening is democratic nations are not standing up or interfering or intervening in these rise of authoritarian governments. And that's a big issue. It's something I noticed about a year ago too, because multiple African governments fell, and they were either democratic or democratic leaning, and they fell to authoritarianism, and they were supported by those other countries. Turkey, a country that I would think is authoritarian, they're in NATO. The fact is we're not standing up for those. And a thought that I had 2, 3, 4 years ago is, why is there a NATO? Why is there a UN? But there's no League of Democratic Nations, no group that is thriving and purposely trying to protect democracies around the world.
Yes.
NATO, yes, it's against Russia. So the origins of NATO, yes. But there's no group that's saying, well, we're going to actively go out and try to promote and protect democracy. And that's a big issue in my mind.
It's really big, you know. So there's a couple, I'm really glad one you brought up, like, okay, there's all these potential different countries. You know, the way Anne sort of broke it down is that, you know, not there's sort of a hierarchy. You know, there's if there's a basis at the bottom, it's like liberal democracy. It's like the rights are imbued of, you know, more of the, I guess, you know, the egalitarian, what was the French democracy, liberty, and we'll have to look that up or put that in there. But that
Yes.
particular phrase is sort of a part of this sort of liberal democracy ethos. But let me just give you some numbers around just the current state of democracy in general, right? So right now, there are more autocracies than democracies in the world. There are 91 autocracies in the world, 88 democracies. Uh, we're at a historical low democracy index, which is what you were noting before. 27 countries since from 2005 to 2025 shifted from democracies to autocracies. Let's see. 39% of the global population is under an authoritarian rule, sort of right now. So if there was a graph, what were we seeing? We're seeing an increase in these sort of authoritarian type democracy. So there are some ideas on the why. So we were talking a little bit about the why. So let's discuss, you know, some of them. And actually, there's a nice headline I just wanted to like give voice to here because it really makes sense, and I want to just sort of point it out to the audience. Is actually potentially climate change having a big issue with potentially authoritarianism. Well, absolutely, right? Because whenever you're messing with resources, whenever there's a change in how there's a regulatory environment, or if there's not enough farmland, like the Arab Spring, the Syrian revolts, frankly, the immigration issues that are happening, of course, in the Western Hemisphere, or at least the hemisphere where America's at, the folks coming from Latin America and coming to the United States. A lot of this stuff's based on climate change. And so it's hard to actually deal with these huge $1 billion or billion people populations. And so whether it is they don't have enough jobs, there's not enough resources, and a strong man and or strong leader has to come in and sort of direct the action where it needs to be. The
Mhm.
other kind of interesting thing, so besides sort of resources and kleptocracy and just wanting to own and take everything, I think that's just as old as kings 10,000 plus years ago, wanting to take over an environment and take it for yourself, and, you know, greed and all the rest. Noah Harari has been actually talking. Yuval Noah Harari, the great historian, has actually been talking about this a lot. I think he actually got negative flack for it because he's not arguing for it, but what he's just talking about, and this is actually a really good article here from New York Times, is that in the future, when you have AI, like, you create ecosystems of information, and large scale democracies might not even be feasible because there's such these ecosystems of information that they could be controlled actually via social media or via information networks and all the rest. And of course, you do see this also happening. It seems that authoritarian governments actually do propaganda very well. They do social media fairly well. They cut off, like, I mean, that's a one thing that we've been discussing here with China, or even some of these other governments, is that they really are very effective at controlling the media, controlling the information flow, and it causes dissension, it causes confusion, it causes misinformation, disinformation, and it also even causes potential harm that we've seen, where conspiracies sort of get out of control and can ultimately lead to violence.
Well, you're
So
hitting
yeah,
it.
we're in a really interesting time here where there's many different factors sort of propelling these authoritarian democracy, or excuse me, authoritarianism sort of all over the world. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. One thing that you were hitting on, right, is authoritarian governments do really well at making decisions, and
Mm,
very quickly. You
right.
don't have to go through a voting process. There's no two sides of an issue. It's one side of an issue, and it gets done. I think one reason that a lot of people are pointing to China right now as being able to be so quickly moving, especially in new energy and
Mm.
defense and things like that, and research, is because there is no dissension, right? There is a decision made and it's done, right? So that is very clear. It's all going to the top, and one person's making that decision. Authoritarian governments move fast, right? I honestly think that World War II would have gone very differently.
Mm.
And if there was more quicker movement, because Hitler with his blitzkrieg throughout Poland and things like that went through so quickly that they didn't even have a time to mount a defense, because it was very quickly done. One person making that decision. It was a horrible decision, but it was one person making that decision. Authoritarian governments move fast. And that is one reason that I think in democracies, they're ultimately very difficult to run, because there are lots of differing opinions, right? And that's just the way it works, even our
Hmm.
own democracy, right?
True.
When you were hitting it on head a little bit with like judges and things like what's going on there in the United States, right? I think that it's clear, right? You can make quicker decisions if you rule out democratic processes. Are they the right decisions? That's not a question for our show, but I think but I think that that's something that it's obvious. And I think one more thing I wanted to point out is, so you're talking about this. So there was a democracy trackers. There's a bunch of different democracy trackers out there. So if you look at like this tracker right here. So this is by idea. So it shows which governments are trending upwards in democracy and democratic values, and which ones are trending down. Right. And if you look, it's a lot more trending down than trending up.
Man.
And so this is a great resource to point out, right? Because and there's a lot of these types of trackers, right? There's freedom of press trackers and things like that. So if you're ever interested in what your country is doing, right, and where you fall into this line, there's a lot of these trackers out there for sure.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought that up. And actually, I did want to like just let's bring it all in, because we're talking about different countries, different leaders. I think we talked, there's sort of different levels to this, but there's actually a lot of stuff happening. And so I'm not really hearing a lot. We don't get a ton of international news in America, not all the time. There's enough to sort of worry or think about. But a lot of stuff in the future of democracy is happening in Europe, especially Eastern Europe right now.
Yes.
So this is a great article, The Four Contests of Democracy in Europe right now, challenging the authoritarianism. We've got, of course, everything that's happening in Georgia, the sort of connection to Kremlin agents, sort of the Russia sort of extension going into Eastern Europe. And so there's a lot of sort of civil resistance, essentially lots of changes that are happening in that government, sort of very early potential changes, and sort of a more democratic leaning, and possibly leaning more towards authoritarianism should some things change. Obviously, we were talking about Viktor Orbán, who has been in power, I think, since 2010. He is. It's a great playbook. If it's great for authoritarianism, took over the courts, strong man. This was the post financial collapse. He othered. He blamed it on Muslims and bankers, and now he's actually has really great power and is viewed as sort of positive figure in many sort of right of center sort of folks. Serbia. This is something I really have not been paying attention to, but there is a lot of nationalistic policies that are happening, or like sort of directions that are coming from Serbia. Serbia, this area of the Eastern Europe has been sort of a turbulent place in general.
It
There
was
are
in
a lot
Serbia,
of
the area.
yes.
I
Yes,
was
and
there.
there's a lot of fights, of course,
Yeah.
happening for democracy right now here in Serbia. And then, of course, as we noted too, Turkey, right? So Erdogan, they are frankly the largest quote unquote democracy, Muslim democracy in the world. They were seen as frankly a positive view of what a Muslim country could do in terms of democratic rule, and now with Erdogan in charge and sort of alignments more towards Asia, more towards the Indias, and of course the Chinas of the world, or maybe even sort of just being kind of similar to what they are, the midway point between Asia and Europe. You're seeing a lot of tumult happening. So frankly, beyond just the fact that there's authoritarianism in governments, there is actually populism, nationalism rising everywhere, and it's rising in all countries, as you noted in that particular area. There's the rise of the far right in both Sweden and Germany. Besides actually even the climate change, as well as the technology that's driving this. One other thing, of course, that I think we've mentioned here is actually the rise of immigration issues, migration in general, this because of climate change, or because of economic issues, or because of XYZ, whatever the issue is. And so it causes dissension, right? Whether it's an American border, whether it's the border of the beaches in Italy, whether it is, the Germans taking in Syrians. It's changing sort of the makeup of countries. It's making it very hard to sort of deal with. And how do you actually handle this as a globe? And one way to do it is to effective border control and blame them for your problems, and then maybe take the monies and resources along with you. So this is a very, very troubling time, something to think deeply on. And yeah, we're going to be paying attention for a really long time, and just hopeful to, the world, that we really steward this as best as we can.